Hello and welcome to another episode of Man Buns and Jesus. And today we consider the question: do you like being told that you're doing something wrong? Because the medieval Catholic Church sure didn't. Feels longer every week.
It does. But it's better than if you try to shorten it, it gets really high pitched and it sounds like a Bugs Bunny cartoon version. Which maybe isn't the worst thing in the world. I'll meditate on that. We'll see where it ends up.
Anyway, welcome back to another episode of Man Buns and Jesus. We're continuing our look at the articles specifically from the Augsburg Confession in the Book of Concord, and we're starting this week into some of the disputed articles in the Augsburg Confession. And these were things where the Lutherans of that time really wanted to make sure that they were being clear, that they felt there were abuses in the Catholic Church that needed to be corrected. And so the next 7 articles are all about specific abuses, mostly related to what the church was doing at that time. Now, I'm sure that makes a great podcast for those of us talking about it, almost 500 years later. But we promised we're working on ways to make this relevant for you. And today we're starting off by looking at Articles 22 and 24. For those of you who speak Roman numerals, that is XXII and XXIV. That's not Josh, apparently.
I've learned up to a certain point, but
Okay. Anyway,
I still can't tell you what the Super Bowl is. That's too high. I can't count that high in Roman numerals.
Anyway.
And for anyone, because I know there are a couple guys listening to this podcast who will then, next time you see me in person, you're going to try and teach me Roman numerals. I have no interest in actually learning Roman numerals. If I really need it that bad, I'll just look it up in the moment. Like it's not something I really care about at all. Just to clarify, if you come up to me on Sunday morning and say, "Hey, I'd like to tell you how to read Roman numerals," I'll say, "Hey, I don't care to know, but thanks."
Anyway, so we're looking at Articles 22 and 24, which one of them explicitly talks about something that the church was doing with the sacrament, and this is something that still exists in the Catholic Church to this day. And the other one is related to the sacrament, but it's honestly mostly just a miscommunication about what's important and what's happening where between Lutherans and Catholics at the time. So we'll dive into that a little bit, and we could probably talk a little bit about how to be more gracious with our brothers and sisters who come from a different denominational tradition, because there's a decent amount of that there. Anyway, a little background on this. Josh, do you want me to dive into those?
I want to share the background that as I understand it and see
Okay,
how
go.
far off I am.
Okay, go ahead.
because this, like, I could see where this would be like a myth that I heard at some point that was presented as fact that could be false. Okay,
Gotcha.
so the Article 22, right,
Yep.
is it's concerning both kinds of the sacrament, and
Yep.
you might say, well, what does that mean? Well, the point is, it's a very simple article, very simple point. It's when you are giving communion to people at a church, they should receive the bread and the wine. And you say, well, that's okay, duh, that's how we do it. It's, well, no, they only, as far as I understand, they only, if you were like a regular old person, you got bread, you did not get wine. You might say, well, that seems, why is that? And as it was explained to me, and I actually think there's some sound reasoning here, but they were dealing with the symptom instead of addressing the cause. Okay, because how communion was explained to people is, this is now the body and blood of Christ, which is true. We talked about that. That was a previous podcast. But apparently, what there were some people who kind of looked at it with a much more magic. Actually, abracadabra comes from loosely the words of institution in Latin.
I think it's hocus pocus.
Hocus pocus. Yes, you're right. So it was looked at kind of magically, and what you got was people would, like, they would spill wine on their clothes, or they would like keep it in their mouth and then later like collect it or put it on something, and then they would worship the clothes, and oh, I have a holy shirt now. And in response to that, the Catholic Church was like, okay, no more wine for you guys, because you should not be worshiping some clothes that you spilled the wine on. And for me, that's like, oh, you're right. We should take steps to keep people from worshiping their shirts. That is a fair, okay, I'm on board with that. But I think the issue is, and you can tell that I am an educator in my background, because when I play through that situation, I'm like, the real problem is no one ever stopped to explain to people well what is going on with communion and why it matters and what it does. And if you were to take a couple steps back and say, let's educate the people in our churches about what communion is and how we should be handling this, the wine wouldn't be as much of an issue. And actually, I think that actually tailors into, look at this, it's almost like we planned it this way. It tailors into Article 24, because one of the things that the Lutherans are getting faulted for is that this is what it says. It says, no noticeable changes have been made in the public celebration of the Mass, which is worship, however you want to call it, except that in certain places, German hymns are sung alongside the Latin responses for the instruction and exercise of the people. For after all ceremonies should serve the purpose of teaching the people what they need to know about Christ. So I can appreciate Luther, and probably Melanchthon probably had something to do with this, because Melanchthon was first and foremost an educator. This idea of, we want to educate people on what is going on here, but also on the things of Christ. And I think that would probably be a better way to handle an abuse of the sacrament, rather than just saying, oh, you only get one of them now. It's like, that's a weird, it's not quite a minor ban. Is it like an extra minor ban? For anyone who, minor ban is when you tell someone they can't come to the communion rail until they deal with generally unrepentant sin, is generally what leads to a minor ban.
I feel like it's like
it's half of a minor ban.
We're starting to develop the like minor leagues of minor bans. So if like,
it's the ECHL of communion bans.
I was going to say it's the AHL, and the further you get from the NHLs, the further you're getting from the sacrament.
Well, but that's okay.
For those of you who don't understand the hockey reference, look it up on your own time. But yeah, I think you're pretty much spot on with the background of the both kind stuff, and like more than just worshiping a shirt that had some wine spilled on it. People would like cheek a little bit of bread, or uh, find other ways to smuggle the wine home. Like they'd vomit it home, so that they had the blood of Christ or the body of Christ. And in some cases, it was used for like alchemy stuff and basically like medieval witchcraft. Some of it sanctioned, some of it not so much. Um, it it was just weird, and like Josh said, a lot of it was probably just down to the Catholic Church did not bother to teach its uh, laity at that point in time, at least in Europe, because it liked the kind of education threshold that gave it power. But yeah, I mean, the full response was not just, we're going to stop giving you wine. The full response was, well, normally, if you think about a body, if there's some flesh, you're going to have a little bit of blood in it. So they're getting both kinds, even if they just get the bread, which is,
Oh,
I mean, it's logical, but it's not how Jesus gave us the meal. So
yeah. Well, and
we reject that. But
communion doesn't operate according to our logical rules in the first place.
yes, also true. I'm preaching on some of the illogical rules of communion in this upcoming Sunday, as we're recording this, not as this podcast is coming out. But yeah, so there was that. And then also, after you took the bread, you went from the priest that gave you the bread to the priest that would check your mouth and make sure you swallowed the bread.
Open wide.
Yeah, exactly. It's so much easier to just go, hey, people, it doesn't work that way.
And
Some of it I will chalk up to the Catholic understanding of the sacrament, right? Because there's this idea in the Catholic Church that once bread and wine have been consecrated, they remain the body and the blood until they go through your system, basically. Which is why if you walk into a Catholic church, they'll have this. Usually, it's a very fancy cabinet somewhere, but depending on the Catholic church, I've seen like.
there's probably a name for it other than the fancy cabinet.
Oh,
I don't know what
there
it
is.
is, but I'm guessing there's a name for it.
It's called a tabernacle. I was getting there, but
Oh.
like in some places it's just a fancy cabinet, and some places it's like a separate altar area. In other places it's like kind of like set into the wall kind of situation. But it's a place that they keep the consecrated elements. Now you'll find Lutheran churches that have tabernacles, but that's just because some Lutheran churches believe that like once you consecrate the elements, you should use them for that purpose. And so that's like where we set the stuff so that we make sure it's set apart for that specific purpose. Or it's a converted Catholic church and it's just a convenient place to store the elements.
Yeah. Well, and I think this is hopefully just a short little side path, but I do think it's worth mentioning because the core of this issue is, well, what are the elements after the celebration is part of the core of this issue. And there are a lot of, like today, if you help to set up or tear down your church, whether it's like Edgewater where it's everything, or just you're helping with the altar and maybe you're part of an altar guild or whatever else, there are a handful of different ways that people handle the elements after the meal is over, after communion is ended. And there are some people who there are some people who get really excited about this one way or another. And the different ways that I have seen in a lot of in a lot of churches, first of all, in most churches, they use wafers. And the thing with wafers is they don't really go bad. So you can keep them week to week. You don't have to worry about, it growing mold. Like, you don't have to deal with it promptly because it's not going to grow mold because there's nothing to it as far as the mold is concerned. And then for the wine, because wine does go bad, right? If you were to just if you have open wine and you keep it for a couple weeks, that wine is not going to be fit for human consumption. And one way that people deal with it is in the church, you will have a drain, a sink or something that goes directly into the ground as opposed to entering the sewer system or the septic tank.
Or people will just take it out to the church garden and dump it straight on the ground themselves.
Yeah. And it is kind of out of respect for, well, let's not mix this thing that has come so close to communion with everything else that goes down our drains. Okay? And I think I think it's fair to treat it with some respect and with some reverence, maybe isn't the right word, but just to be careful how we treat it. Another way that some churches handle it is the pastor will finish whatever is left. And the church that I went to in college did that. And you play a dangerous game there as a pastor, because if your altar guild overestimated how much wine you were going to need that day, you're drinking a fair bit of wine before you finish the service. And especially if you have another service after that, that's a dangerous game you have played. Although I guess you wouldn't necessarily have to finish between services, but that's the way you deal with it. There are no leftovers because the pastor finished them.
There's the amended version. Amended version of that, which is like at the end of the service, pastor, altar guild, maybe the elders who are on duty will finish all of the elements kind of after everything is settled down rather than during the service. I've seen that too.
Yeah. And honestly, I don't have a major issue with either of those approaches. And there are some people who they have different ways and they just store it for the next week. And I think as long as you're making sure nothing's breeding bacteria and mold, I think you're fine with that approach as well. But yeah, it's something that people get really, some people get really up in arms about. And I think as long as you're treating it with respect, you're probably fine.
Yeah, I think to kind of summarize that, I think there are 3 ways that you can respectfully dispose of the remaining elements: human consumption, return it to the ground, or save it and reuse it in a future week. Once you've kind of dedicated it for that purpose, it should stay for that purpose. That's, I think, kind of the rule of thumb.
Yeah. But it's not something to take home and worship.
Yes. Yep.
And it's this weird.
I mean, it's like a sanctuary, right? You dedicate a sanctuary for the worship of God.
So don't throw a rave in there.
Yeah, exactly. You dedicate communion wine for the purpose of communion. So don't use it to get drunk or make an idol out of.
Yeah, I mean that the example of the sanctuary, I think, nails it right on the head. Because what we're treading on the ground of, we don't know exactly how communion works. Like if you're saying, well, so when does it become the body and blood of Christ? Exactly. I don't know. Is it with the words of institution? Is it when you can, like, when are we, like, he just kind of says it is.
There are 2 major camps on that. It's either at the words of institution, they call those consecrationists, or at as the communion elements are handed to the person taking communion, and you hear those words,
For
the
you.
body of Christ given for you, the blood of Christ shed for you. We call those receptionists. And our brothers and
Hey,
sisters,
my dentist has one of those.
yeah, our brothers and sisters in the, I think it's the Evangelical Lutheran Church or Evangelical Lutheran Synod, and the Wisconsin Synod, still don't disagree on, or still don't agree on that definition, and it's been a touch point between them in the past, even though they're in fellowship. Um, I I'm honestly not sure what the official LCMS position is.
I
But
think it is one of those things where like the Bible doesn't tell us enough to nail this down, so we're just going to kind of treat it with respect regardless.
I
Which I
think
think is
that's,
appropriate.
yeah, I think that's the safest ground to stand on,
Because
uh,
there are a lot of
regardless.
things you could nitpick with it. For example, at our congregation, we commune by intinction, so there is not much wine we need. We have a cup, and we use little bottle like the little bottles that college sorority girls love to have on hand.
Yeah,
Just the little bottles of wine, you get them, and the reason we do that is because then you open one, you use it for the week, and we're not trying to store wine
yeah,
because we're most of our stuff gets packed into a shipping container. That is not climate controlled. And then we just don't have to worry about it. But we don't use even that whole little bottle. We fill the cup part way and there's some left over. And the question is, well, if that or the wine that's in the container in the back, does that accidentally get consecrated because it's wine in the same you have to say, well, how far does how far does it go? How far does it count? When does it start to count? And it's like, okay, let's treat it all with respect, because even if it's not the body and blood of Christ, it has been set aside for this purpose at some point.
yeah,
So let's treat it with respect and take the meal seriously. And also remember, like, our God is a God of grace. So if we do something boneheaded out of ignorance, it's not okay, but He'll forgive us for it. So
yeah,
we do our best.
yeah.
Because then you
The
also have, well, what happens if you have a bottle of wine and there's a little bit of drips left in it, and you throw that bottle away, and now, like, what did you just throw away drips of the blood of Christ in a trash can with the donuts and whatever else? It's not worth thinking about. It's not worth overthinking, I don't think, because there are no answers for you.
yeah,
Jesus says, "This is my body, this is my blood. Do this in remembrance of me."
yeah. I think the maybe the best way to look at it is kind of holistically, like, if it's consecrated, if it's given, if it's been set aside for that purpose, treat it with respect, even if we don't know exactly how this all works, because as Luther liked to say, we don't believe in uh, we don't believe in transubstantiation, we don't believe in consubstantiation. We just believe that Christ is sacramentally present in the meal. He's there to do what he's going to do. And that means he's there in body and blood, and he's there to give us forgiveness, life, and salvation. But exactly how that works is for him to know and for us to find out. As I think as long as we do it relatively reverently and with as much care as we can, reasonably offer, we're good.
So the summary of this part is theology is worth thinking about, because otherwise you might accidentally end up worshiping a shirt.
Yeah.
Because, like, this seems like a very niche theological topic that you're like, of course these guys want to talk about it, they're pastors. But the reality is, the issue wasn't with what the priests were doing. Well, it is with what the priests were doing, but they weren't the core of the issue. The core of the issue was a bad response to the laity not being taught well.
Yeah. Yeah.
So do we want to shift to talking more about the Mass?
Yeah, I was going to actually give us a nice transition for that, and then you just
I just went
brute
like a bull
forced
in a
it.
china shop.
The thing I was going to say is a big part of the reason that the teaching wasn't so hot was because of how the Catholic Church in that time did the Mass. They were still Latin Mass only, which I don't mind if you want to do your worship services in a specific language that evokes, tradition and history. The Catholic Church are not the only ones that do that or did that. There are still, hardcore Latin Mass only kind of people in the Catholic Church, but there are also several denominations of Eastern Orthodoxy that only use Church Slavonic. I want to say it's either the Coptic or Ethiopian Orthodox Church that uses a like old school Greek native African language hybrid kind of thing that's not in vogue in the countries that they were or that they're dominant in. So there's just it. There are other places where this happens too, but the thing that sets the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages apart from even the modern Catholic Church continuing to use the Latin Mass is that they insisted on everything being in Latin. So the only way that you really got to know about the Mass was if you were educated, and that was a pretty small sliver of the population at that day and time. And if your Latin was good enough from your education to actually pick up on what was going on. And worth noting, a lot of the people who became priests were like the younger children of nobles who probably didn't care that much in their studies anyway, so their Latin probably also sucked. So if you were unfortunate enough to get some random like nepotism baby priest at your parish that sucked at Latin, even if you knew Latin, you might not know what was going on because that priest might not know Latin. So like the whole thing was a mess. And the big thing that Luther's really getting at with the Mass is like, yes, it should center around the sacrament. That's why we're lumping these things together, because these are both complaints that end up kind of circling around communion. But how we get there, according to Luther, is much more important than the fact that we're just doing it. And that's going to be a pretty big contention, at least for Lutherans and Catholics at that time. Sorry, that was a lot, Josh. Anything you want to really open up on there?
No, but I think it draws our attention to, and we might have had this conversation before, but like what is the center of worship? Because at least to my ear, and I would imagine to a lot of our listeners, a lot of you guys who are listening on this podcast and in a manner taking part in this conversation, the idea of leading a worship service in a language that no one in front of you understands is insane. Why would you do that? And there are in the Lutheran Church, there tend to be two extremes. There tend to be people who they want to do things traditionally. They want to do things by the book in the hymnal. They want their services just so. And they find some support in this article because what Luther is kind of trying what the Augsburg Confession is trying to correct is this idea that the Lutherans have, the Protestants, whatever they're going by at this point, have been accused of just kind of throwing out these services and these ceremonies and these traditions that have been in the Catholic Church for however long. And he's defending. He's like, no, we're holding on to these traditions. And there are people on the traditional side of worship, of modern worship, that say, see, we should be upholding the tradition. But on the other side, Luther's making this point: we're replacing the Latin hymns and Latin responses in places with German hymns for the instruction and exercise of the people. After all ceremonies should serve the purpose of teaching the people what they need to know about Christ. And there are people who are on the more contemporary side that say, hey, like, look, we need to contextualize our worship more. And I think what is most important here is exactly what Luther, I keep saying Luther. It's
Melanchthon.
It's Melanchthon. That's my bad.
I think I've made that mistake a couple times too. So,
but
take that as a correction for both of us.
He writes is, all ceremonies should serve the purpose of teaching the people what they need to know about Christ.
Yep.
And upholding the value. So we say there are things that we have done traditionally in worship that are critical, that are important, that we should maintain, but we should do them in such a way that they are bringing people closer to Christ. So if that means you take a traditional liturgy and maybe you replace a few these and nows with you, and you colloquialize the language a little bit, I think that is perfectly in line with what is going on here. But if you say, well, we don't want anything that looks traditional, it's like, well, hold on. Those traditions do have a lot of value, right? They've been making sure that the whole service is centered around Christ this whole time. Because fundamentally, the most important thing we're doing in worship is drawing closer to Him. It is not about the songs. It is not about us glorifying God, although that is an important part. The most important part is we are receiving forgiveness for our sins. And that happens in confession and absolution, and that happens in communion. So the service should be centered around that. And if you talk to me about worship, and it kind of comes from this. It's like, okay, so what do you need for worship? Like, what are the important parts? And as far as I'm concerned, here are the things that are non-negotiable. You need confession and absolution. If not, you can call it something else. You can say it's a time of praise or whatever, but if you don't have confession and absolution, you're missing something. I think you should have communion if at all possible. I know that it's not always logistically possible to have it every week, but communion is an important part of this. You should read from Scripture. You should speak one of the creeds to affirm our faith, to affirm this connection we have to Christ. And you should probably have a sermon. And you should be praising and thanking God for what. So these are the things. You might say, well, there's a lot of flexibility there. Yeah, there's a lot of flexibility there. Because the point being made in this article, and this isn't the only place in the Book of Concord where the authors are making this point. The point is, how are we drawing people closer to Christ? How are we making sure people are receiving forgiveness for their sins? And how are we adapting that to make sure we are serving the people? How are we adapting that to make sure not that what we're doing is most popular necessarily, or it's something that they're enjoying or they're liking. No, how are we genuinely serving them and drawing them closer to Christ? And sometimes that might be challenging. Sometimes that might be going to a contemporary audience and say, hey, listen, there's a lot of substance in traditions. And you might not enjoy it as much as you enjoy a contemporary worship, but the substance in traditions is something we're drawing you close to. So we're going to do that a little bit. And then on the other side, it might be, hey, people who are really used to traditional, you might be out of touch with some of the more emotional sides of this experience of forgiveness. And the contemporary structure can help you to experience that forgiveness more holistically. So we're going to draw you into that a little bit. There are things to be said for all these different approaches to worship. And I think it is important for us to recognize that they each have strengths and weaknesses in mind of, again, the point of this article, which is, how can we best teach people what they need to know about Christ? So there's my hot take on worship. People on both sides are probably not thrilled with me, but you know what? That's never stopped me before. So
Yeah, if you're angering the extremes, you're probably about right. Um,
that's something Bierman said in the last class I took with him. He was like, the middle space is uncomfortable because you don't look exactly like anyone on either extreme, so none of them will accept you or trust you or whatever.
yeah, you
But
don't
that's
get a
the right
party.
place to be. So you gotta like sitting on the fence is uncomfortable, but if that's the place where you're supposed to be, buckle up. Just deal with the discomfort.
At some point, you start to get a wedgie.
And my filter is still working today, so that's good that I didn't respond to that comment.
So I want us to go back to a couple of the like background pieces for the mass specifically, and another part of why it was so important for uh, worship services to be held in a language that people understood was that over like 500-600 years, I think it kind of started with Aquinas. Somebody can correct me on this, but that's what my brain is telling me. There was this kind of development towards the mass being this extra sacrifice for sin. So, like, the idea was Jesus' sacrifice on the cross paid the price for our original sin. And then the sacrifice of the mass was designed to take care of the day-to-day stuff. And I don't know how that necessarily came to be. It's not particularly scriptural, um, where Paul and Peter and John and other writers of the New Testament cite the death of Christ for the forgiveness of sins. It's pretty all encompassing. So the fact that this developed or was able to develop, I think speaks to the fact that the people didn't know what was going on. Because if you have an educated lady, they're able to call you out when you start talking heresy. Well, it probably doesn't develop into heresy. Maybe heterodoxy. It might be heresy. I don't know. It toes the line. It toes the line. It really does. But this is part of why when you meet Catholics, they're so insistent on going to Mass because they feel like they need to be there to receive forgiveness um, for their day to day sin. They need that sacrifice every week. Otherwise, it's just not enough. And like Luther's like, no, this is just an opportunity for us to, like, yeah, receive forgiveness, but we're partaking in the one sacrifice for all time. That's what this is. Let's let that be that. Um, yeah, there are some other like redemption related theological nuggets that Luther really leans into in Article 24. Um, but it really circles around like the Mass becomes something it was never intended to be. It becomes its own separate sacrifice instead of a celebration of the one sacrifice that was made for us for all time. Um, and the fact that that got lost, and the fact that I think it still kind of remains lost um, in some Christian circles in the United States. Like, you walk into a contemporary service in a lot of church bodies, even ones that are more sacramental in nature, you may not see this kind of stuff. Like, you may not see any real focus on receiving the gifts of God. It's more like a lecture. But on the same token, you walk into a more traditional congregation who are very sacramental, you again might start to lose some of the like instruction on why we do the things that we do. So finding that balance, regardless of what format you want to do it in, finding that balance is essential to forming good Christians, discipling good Christians when it comes to our understanding of worship.
Yeah.
Has been since Melanchthon wrote and Luther was arguing things, is now, and probably will be forever. Amen.
So, as our listeners, what we encourage you to do is to, when you're talking about things around worship, recognize that when you're having, especially when you're having conversations with people who aren't seeing eye to eye with you, that they might be prioritizing some different thing that they're getting out of worship, that some different element of worship than you are. And that's not to say that they're right, that's not to say that you're right. You just recognize that there are different important pieces that are playing into this, and that they're worth addressing. And sometimes if you get at, well, so why are you so insistent on this, doing this a certain way? And you have that frank conversation, not in kind of a harsh way, but just in a, what's the motivation here? That can probably lead us to a place where we are better connecting to each other, where we are better connecting to Christ in a way that he would be proud of. Because he doesn't call us to be divided. He doesn't call us to argue over stupid things and squabble. He calls us to come together, to worship him, to receive his gifts. And yeah, but Ben's right. Like, this is an argument where they called it the worship wars, which I think there have been points in my life where I would probably have argued for one side or the other, but I have reached a I've reached a point, like, I'm not just blowing smoke over here. I've genuinely reached the point, I think almost every style of worship, almost every way to approach it, it has strengths, it has weaknesses, and there are benefits to it. And frankly, I think it's worth us saying we're going to use, and I know this is wholly impractical, and I don't think there's any place that I would probably actually be able to pull this off. But I would love to just do one where, you know what, we do traditional some Sundays, we do contemporary some Sundays, we do like a campfire kind of thing some Sunday, like, and you change it so that you are able to receive the benefits from all of these different approaches to worship. But I realize that's not wholly practical from an organizational standpoint, not to mention you'd have people who say, oh, that Sunday's the traditional, I'm not going that Sunday, or that Sunday's the contemporary, I'm not going that Sunday. And not looking to alienate people because, you know, that's counterintuitive, right? So, hot takes all around on worship. We have classmates who might want to kick me out of the Synod after a comment like that, but probably not. Hopefully not.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
One last kind of piece on this. So a lot of the frustration or conflict that ended up rising out of the discussions between Luther and Melanchthon and the Catholic Church during the time where these articles were being written, and the Apology, which is another section that we didn't even get into today. A big part of it was just that on occasions both sides were unwilling to be gracious about the other's position. We saw it a little bit today with the way that the Catholic Church has responded. It's referenced in Article 24. The way that
maybe a little bit of deliberately misunderstanding what the Protestants were trying to do.
Yeah,
to paint them in a little worse light.
Yeah, there's a straw man being set up, and it just allows the Catholic Church to, you know, make their argument the way that they want to make their argument without really engaging in a real conversation. And there are moments, especially later in Luther's life, where he does some pretty similar things and speaks kind of disingenuously about some of his opponents. And that's something that, as Christians, we're, again, as Josh said, called to seek unity. So as we do so, let's
authentically interact with our points of difference.
Yeah.
Instead of trying either on one side to pretend they don't exist, or on the other side to set them up like straw men to try and knock each other down.
Yeah. And if you're going to listen to your Baptist neighbor discuss their position on communion, shut up and listen. And then have a conversation.
Yeah, and then, maybe point out things that we think are, we're not saying we suddenly agree with.
No, we're right. And we're going to be kind of smug about the fact that we're right. But you got to at least engage in the practice of listening.
Well, and here's something that the esteemed Dr. Jeff Gibbs said. He will never be a guest on this podcast because we record on Zoom. So he won't do it. Unless for some reason Ben and I end up in St. Louis at the same time, we might be able to get him in a room to record a podcast episode with him.
We just got to tie him down to a chair.
No, I think he would do it if he didn't have to log on to Zoom. I don't know. But what he said is you should be the smartest guy in the room when you're talking about theology. And he's talking to a class of pastors as they're going out. And you might say, well, that's a little arrogant. It's like, well, by credit hour, we're some of the best educated clergy in the country. That aside, but then his follow-up was, you have to be right, but you also have to be the nicest guy in the room.
Because everybody hates that smug guy who's smarter than everybody else.
Yeah, hold on. You
got a quote
for me. I'm looking up a quote.
All right. So as Josh is looking up that quote, we'll start to transition a little bit into takeaways because I think this will probably be a good takeaway for today. But as Josh is looking that one up, I think my takeaway for today is that communion is important. Our understanding of communion is important. Reading the scripture on communion is important. And the fact that we hopefully, as pastors, don't want to try and hide anything from you about communion or the ways that we do things, the practices that we have, the disagreements that we have, should be a sign that we want to get this right. And so we want you to join us in trying to get this and other things concerning our worship right. And sometimes there are going to be a lot of right answers. So be open to that.
And the quote that I was looking for that is going to seem really out of place now that Ben has shared this profound takeaway with us.
No, this will be perfect. Jarring transitions are kind of our thing.
Yeah, it's a quote from Rick and Morty, which is a terrible animated TV show that I do enjoy. And Rick is the smartest man in the universe. This is most of the premise of the show. Rick is the smartest man in the universe. And his grandson, Morty, is not. And they're having a little bit of a tiff in this episode. And Morty turns to him and says, when you're an a-hole, no one cares how right you are. They don't want to give you the satisfaction. So, that's the quote I was looking for to cap off our... But my takeaway for today is, when we're talking about things about communion and worship, we should be respectful and reverent of what we're doing in all of our considerations, how we treat it, how we approach it, how we go about it. And a little bit of respect, I think, takes care of a lot of the other issues we might run into. So, with that, brothers and sisters, go in peace. Serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
This has been a presentation of Man Buns and Jesus, bringing you into conversations to deepen your faith and your understanding. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to reach out in the comments on Spotify or YouTube, or message us on our Facebook page. Before you leave, make sure to rate the podcast, subscribe to keep up to date on new content, and share with a friend.